Welcome and thank you for standing by. At this time, all attendees are in a listen-only mode. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted publicly. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I'd now like to turn the call over to Erlene Dowell. Erlene, you may begin.
Thank you, Greg. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We will save all our questions to the end of the presentation. Please add your questions into the Q&A box and we'll read them out loud after the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees at this time. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the May Local Employment Dynamics, or LED, webinar. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome Alan Spell and Justin Crone as they present the importance of off-farm income to the agriculture economy. Off-farm jobs and income are critically important to farmers and ranchers as the rural and agricultural economy has evolved over the past half-century to benefit connected and diverse communities. While growing rural and urban economic interdependence can be hard to see at times, an appreciation of this dynamic relationship is vital to informing policies that strengthen the financial health of communities and agricultural producers alike. Misunderstanding of rural, connectiveness in industry, diversity can lead to well-intentioned federal programs that actually hinder policy efforts to support these communities. Using the longitudinal employer household dynamics, origin destination employment statistics, or LOADS data, studies found commuting gains speed, especially in rural counties. Alan Spell is an assistant extension professor in the University of Missouri's Division of Applied Social Sciences. Spell's current work includes industry and workforce analysis, regional economic development, economic impact studies, and spatial data analysis. Alan has worked in economic workforce development for over 25 years in various roles, including labor and industry research, land planning, and site selection. He holds degrees in economics and landscape architecture, as well as a certification as an economic research professional. Prior to joining the university in January 2020, Alan led the Missouri Economic Research and Information Center at the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. Justin Crone is a research project analyst for the Center for Applied Research and Engagement Systems for the University of Missouri Extension. Justin works within SQL Server and utilizes Python, R, and PowerShell to complete other data-related tasks. He works to automate data flows from beginning to end, including data download, processing, and mapping visualization with these and other tools. Justin has a bachelor's in science in natural resources from Washington State and a master's in geography from Western Illinois University, with a post-baccalaureate certificate in community development and planning. Justin is currently pursuing his PhD in geoinformatics with an interest in conservation, natural resources management, and their human dimensions. With that, I welcome my friend and colleague, Alan Spell.
Thank you, Arlene, and thank you all for attending today. We're going to start off here talking about some trends that we found in this report. And the report that we're basing this off on was completed last year, and it was commissioned by CoBank, part of the Farm Credit System, to really look at how the agriculture economy had changed over a long period of time, and really what that means with off-farm income. And in doing this analysis, Justin and myself really found some interesting trends, especially with the visual analysis and GIS that we're able to do some pretty interesting mapping. So let's go ahead and dive right in. So there's two big trends that are fundamental to the idea of how our economies are changing over time. Economically successful communities are regionally connected. So successful rural counties, they often disappear over time. Successful rural counties often disappear. Why is that? It sounds scary, but actually there's a reason for that, and we'll show that coming up here. then how can we understand the connectedness of these areas outside of metropolitan communities? Metropolitan areas, by definition, are connected economies, but how do we understand that in those places outside of those areas? So this is one of the things that we were tasked with understanding here, this research. The other one is that rural communities are increasingly diverse. Agriculture is vital to our rural areas, no doubt, and it's vital to our country. But productivity gains continue to change the economic landscape, and so it's important to understand how that's changing. And we often think of rural and agriculture as really synonymous. If you're in a rural area, agriculture is a part of your earnings and your existence. But this really does hide the underlying diversity of most rural communities and the industries that drive these communities. So let's look at this in some mapping and some data here. So metro county expansions, while that happens, they often hide rural gains. So if we look at this map to the right here, counties classified as metro and non-metro from 1974 to 2015, that's a long time period that we're covering over here. You can see that really a lot of the early and later change, and that's your light purple and blue and darker purple, in metropolitan areas. Those are those places that became metropolitan over that time. They're almost always adjacent to a metropolitan area. So these rural communities are getting reclassified because they're just part of that network of commuting that's happening. And of course, this is something that's not new, but it really does tend to hide the fact that there's a lot of rural communities that are economically tied to larger areas, larger cities, but they just disappear as they are being captured into metropolitan classifications. So 57% of the population lived in non-metro counties in 1940, but only 14% in 2018. And that's because of these cities expanding and non-metro counties being reclassified. Now, to back up just for a second, there's different ways to define rural. The way we're using here is just to really use the most simplistic way to look at rural and non-rural by using the metro and non-metropolitan classifications. There's other ways to do that, but for all the data that we needed to do this report, this was the best way to make that distinction. Now, 4 out of every 5 counties reclassified over this long time period from 1974 to 2015 were adjacent to existing metropolitan areas. And as of 2019, 65% of the U.S. non-metropolitan population lived adjacent to metro. So this trend is going to continue on. And that's why I say successful rural areas disappear, because they get gobbled up by the metropolitan areas. But what happens is that what's left over, the rural areas, seem to be sometimes considered maybe not part of our regional economies because they're left behind, if you will. But in reality, they have always been pretty closely tied to our metropolitan areas.
So as part of the analysis, we examined some of the commuting trends from the origin destination data set. And we did it at a variety of levels that you can see here. So first, you'll notice that overall, the proportion of people who were leaving their home county for work outside of that county increased across the board for the entire US. And you can see on that chart there from 2002, where the earliest loads data is available, to 2018, we saw about a 7 percentage point increase across all counties. But when we broke that out into metro and non-metro counties, we saw that commuting out of the county grew faster in those non-metro counties. So you can see that for non-metro counties, it was almost 11 percentage points difference from 2018 to 2002, whereas metro counties, that growth was only 6 percentage points. And on the right there, you see those farm-dependent counties. So those are non-metro counties where it's 15% of labor earnings or 15% of residents who are employed work in agriculture. For those farm-dependent counties, we saw a growth of 10 percentage points for people who are commuting out of their home county for work. Next slide, Alan. So we kind of examined this at a national scale. And so in 2002, about 46.8% of counties with available data had at least half of their residents commuting outside of the county for work. By 2018, that was up to 70.6% of counties, where at least half the residents commuted out. You can see this increase on the map here on the right, where the orange and yellow counties are those where at least half the residents who worked commuted outside of their home county. You'll notice some counties with a little red border, those are your farm-dependent counties. So you can just see the change from 2002 to 2018 is pretty stark between those two time periods. We looked at Spencer County, Kentucky as an example to further visualize some of this change in connectedness. Spencer County is a farm-dependent county near the Louisville metro region. In 2002, it already had a higher than average percent of residents commuting out at 85%. By 2018, that number was up to 90% of residents who were commuting out. You can see from the density map in both years, Louisville, Jeffersontown was the primary destination. This is a really poignant example of how these metro and farm-dependent regions are interconnected, and we'll continue to go into that, the importance of that more through this presentation.
So what we've noticed is this larger out commuting, especially in rural areas, especially in farm-dependent areas, which is interesting. And we note also that rural jobs are changing as well. As really agriculture gets more and more productive, we just need less workers in those spaces. So if you think about in 1970, now this is shown here in the chart to the right. If you look at 1970, at that time, 15% of all jobs in non-metropolitan areas were in agriculture or farm-related type of activities. Now you move ahead to 1990, it's just under 10%. You move ahead to 2010, it's just under 7%. And by 2019, 6.5%. Now, during that time, agricultural output has continued to decline. It's just that we need less and less workers. And similarly, in manufacturing, you see manufacturing go from 20% in 1970 and all the way down to 10%, just over 10.8% in 2019. Similar dynamic of output in manufacturing is still going up, but we're just needing less and less people to do those activities. So these are still very vital to these communities because they represent new dollars. They're export-oriented industries. They represent new dollars coming into those communities, but we just need less people working in that space. So we need to care about the other industries there as well. And you can see that what has been gaining is services. And that's your retail, your healthcare, especially in healthcare and restaurants, we've been seeing growth, professional and technical services. So you see that going from 4 out of every 10 jobs in 1970 to nearly 6 out of 10 jobs in 2019. And so that dynamic is happening, but it's happening differently in different places. So what we did is broke out the regions by the USDA farm production regions. And you can see the map to the left there. There's the Western area, there's the Plain States, there's the Midwest, the Atlantic, which is really that Northeast part and all the way to Tennessee and Kentucky, and then the South. Now, if you look at those areas and you look at the different makeup of counties and specializations in 2015, when we had some information from the USDA, we can see that for all non-metro areas, you can see that graph on the left, for all non-metro, farming was 20% of the counties that were there that were specialized like that. Manufacturing was 18%, non-specialized 30%, recreation 12%, mining 9%, and fed and state government 12%. But then if you look at the West, you can really see recreation as a big part of those non-metropolitan counties. In almost 1 in 4 counties, recreation is really their specialization as a county. Still pretty high in agriculture, but you can also see mining is bigger than the average as well. And so manufacturing is pretty small in that in that group relative to others. Then you can move over to the plains, and that's where you see the really specific farm specialized counties. That's from North Dakota all the way down to Texas. You see about 4 out of every 10 counties are specialized in agriculture. And that's the real big mix there, along with mining. And then in the West, it's a little more diverse, but we're heavier in manufacturing county dependent counties. And then the Atlantic is more in the services. And of course, that's including that Northwest area and all the bigger metros that we have there. And then in the South, really a lot of diversified industries. And so it is important to understand how it changes based on these different regions. But the big story is that we're becoming more and more of a mix of counties that are dependent on really diverse type of economies. And that's important because diversity helps us when we have tough times in one sector or another. We have diverse economies, and that helps with jobs and so forth. So that was important to understand. And really, farming is really concentrated in that plains areas. And that's an important takeaway from this here. Because if we look at where farm dependent communities are in America, and that map to the left there, farm dependent counties from 1974 to 2015, you really see in that dark green consistent farm dependent counties over that long time period are really concentrated in that plains area, right? And then you can see places that have started to change to be non-farm dependent, and that starts to get in those blues, those darker blues. You can see them starting to change really around the periphery of those plains state counties and in the Midwest there. So that dynamic is changing. Now, what we're seeing is when we look over at the population map, is we're seeing that decline in population a lot of times is concentrated in those farmer dependent communities that are more isolated from higher population areas. And so you can see that relationship a little bit as you look at the map to the right. And so there's a lot of information going on there, but hopefully the visual kind of shows you that really farm dependent regions that were less able to diversify have seen their populations decline. So what are these trends in summary? Well, economically successful communities are regionally connected. We've talked about the fact that a lot of successful rural communities are actually becoming metro areas, part of metro areas, and so we're losing them from the rural side of it. 4 out of every 5 counties are reclassified as metro over those 4 decades. And in 2018, over half of non-metro and 62% of farm-dependent counties had residents that commuted outside of their county for work. So that's really important. They're commuting outside of their home county to find employment. That's up 10 percentage points over that 2 decades. That's pretty substantial. And again, shows you that it really does matter where you work and where you live. Those 2 places a lot of times are not in the same county, even, as we can see. And then that rural communities are increasingly diverse economies. We need less workers in agriculture. It's getting more productive. 15% of non-metro county employment was the norm in 1970. Now we're down to 6.5%. And of course, we're replacing that with service jobs. And only 20% of the non-metro counties are economically specialized in farming when we look at it in 2015, whereas 30% are diversified economies. So really, rural and agriculture are not synonymous. Matter of fact, most people who live in rural communities don't work in agriculture. And I think that's an important understanding, not to put down agriculture at all. It's very vital. It's just when it relates to jobs, we need less and less of those workers in those areas. And so we need to really think about, when we think about economic development, it needs to be encompassing of these diverse economies. And why is that important? Well, now we're going to turn to the idea of off-farm income. So what is off-farm income, first off? Well, you're a producer, you're a farmer, you're a rancher, and you have on-farm income, and that's money that you make from the sale of your produce. But then off-farm income, a large part of that is from having a payroll job somewhere else. And so you're going maybe for your day job, you're working at a manufacturing plant, but then you come home in the evenings and you're working on your farm. on the weekends. It also can mean unearned, what we call unearned income, which is things like retirement income, Social Security pensions can be a part of that off farm as well. But you can see the trend here. In 1970, nearly 40% of the farm income was part of the household income. So about 40% of your income. So even at that time, less than half of your income was from the farm, but still it was 40%. And as we've moved across the decades to 2019, we're getting to where it's typically less than 20% of total household income for a farm is from actually farm income. So that's an important understanding, is that it really does require to have other jobs and other diverse industries around in the area to help supplement those farm incomes. It's important for those farms to survive. And the reason being is that if you look at the median farm income across these different regions that we saw earlier, in a typical year, the farm income for the median farmer, and that's the middle point, more half or higher, half or lower, but typically it's negative dollars for that farm income. You can see it from 2011 to 2019 that really it's hard being a farmer. We kind of heard that before, and we know that, but it really gets shown here when we look at the median farm income. Now, of course, there's a lot of farmers out there. Most farmers are smaller, and that's why we're seeing a lot of this negative farm income. Very large farms, very large operators have positive income because they have economies of scale. But when you put it all together and you look at the average farmer, they're not making positive farm income. But that all farm income in the blue bar there is generally what's helping support that family household. So that's why it's so important to have those jobs in other industries. And to help understand that story a little bit more, Justin had done some maps there to the right. You can see from 2002, Census of Agriculture, and the bottom map is 2017 Census of Agriculture. You can see the principal operators with full and part-time employment by county really exploded over that time period, over those 15 years. You can see that it's a thing that's growing even in some of these bigger counties out west, which is a lot of territory to cover, but it's growing there as well. If we look at the off-farm income of operators, it's really been something important to them for a long time. Even back in 1974, off-farm occupation was the main job of 37% of farm operators. So a third were actually calling another job off the farm their main job. Well, you move ahead to 2017 and it's over half of those operators. So again, another data point to kind of show you over time how that importance of off-farm income has grown, and especially when you're talking about the large amount of debt that farmers have to go into to buy equipment and to do the things that they need to do on the farm. It really is vital to have that support of off-farm income. So why is this important? Well, because we care about farming and we care about agriculture. We care about stabilizing farms and rural economies. And so as they become more diverse, we understand that we don't need as many jobs in agriculture, but we still need to support those industries, obviously. But going from 15% of non-metro county jobs in 1970 to less than 7% in 2019 just shows you we're switching over to different jobs. A lot of times in healthcare and retail and in other industries, restaurants. Services have grown from 41% to 51% of jobs in non-metro areas over that time. And most principal operators, that's our principal farmers or ranchers, consider off-farm occupations their main job, their main income job there. And that's really important for smaller farms, especially because they're this reduces their financial stress in a year because farm incomes can be very volatile as they go up and down with commodity prices. So it's really especially important for small farmers, but even large operations, which I told you are generally positive on their farm income, even they value off-farm jobs because they offer some reliable income, so income that's going to come in and year out, regardless of how the season goes and how the weather is. And also healthcare and retirement benefits as well. So here's just a couple of maps or a couple of ways that we highlighted these different regions. We produced maps for the farm production regions, which are there again at that map, and there's a lot of information here, but we repeated some of the information about the part-time employment, about the commuting, some of the information about the types of farms there, the percentage of farms where operators work full-time on the farm in that region, and for example, in the West region versus the U.S. average. So for example, in the West region, we see that there's basically larger farms on average, 575 acres compared to 373 for the U.S. average. You would expect that with larger land out in the West, but they're pretty typical of some of those other things. Then we also did it by USDA farm resource regions, which is a little bit different way to slice up the U.S. in terms of really kind of the different crops that are grown, and did it for livestock that are used there as well. So that information is available on this report as well. I'll turn it back over to Justin.
Thanks, Alan. So for those of you who are interested, we have made a lot of this loads commuting data available in our map room at careshq.org. It's free and easy to access by anyone. And now I want to acknowledge the census has a great application for visualizing the loads data with on the map, but we aren't trying to compete with that, but we do have some other unique features. So we have in our map room 28,000 other layers that you can add to the map. You can create custom maps, you can overlay and query and do some swipe between different layers and things like that. So there's a lot of really neat tools here, a lot of really interesting data. And you can export these map images and use them in presentations or printed material, things like that. We do have a lot of additional layers from the census, including ACS and the decennial census. We've also got data around health, education, broadband, agriculture, and natural resources, and a ton more. So I encourage you to check it out at careshq.org. Alan, could you go to the next slide? And then for this loads data, I just thought there might be some interest for how we actually do that, process this. So we created a custom application where you can just input your data set that you'd like, which includes the workplace area characteristic, residential area characteristics, or the origin destination data. You can input your year. And so this goes through, automatically downloads for every state in the US, extracts it and imports it into SQL Server. We then have separate data processing where we can calculate the distance between block pairs, aggregate data to different geographies, including census tracts, counties, census block groups. And then we calculate out, at those geographies, the mean commuting distance, the number of people who commute out, who commute in, who commute within the county. Or we've also done some commuting connection visualizations and changes over time. And in our map room, we also have the workplace area characteristics. And so if you go to the next slide, Alan, we can see an example of some of these layers that are available at CARES HQ. And you can switch between your geographies very easily. And then you can see there some of the layers. So we have the mean resident commute distance. So how far are they traveling? The number of commuters in and out. And then we've got also the workplace area characteristics. So the number of jobs in agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting by county, the percent of the jobs that makes up for the whole county. And we've got that for each sector that's in the workplace area characteristics. So just something, if you are interested in data and maps and you use this kind of data in your work, you might be interested in some of what this CARES HQ has to offer. So I think we can now, we're ready for questions if there are any questions.
Thank you, Justin and Alan. Before we get to the questions, the presentation will be accessible on the Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab. Greg has added the link in the chat. Again, please type all your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees.
Okay. For our first question is actually a comment from Anthony. With the new debt ceiling negotiations, part of the give by the Biden administration may be, quote, leases, unquote, for energy. This would seem to fit with the benefits of our rural areas. West, Midwest, Atlantic come to mind. Okay, our first question is from Danielle. Are migrant workers captured in this agricultural data or only permanent residents?
This would could capture some migrant workers, but I would say it's probably, when we're talking about commuting data, probably more likely just residents who are living in those communities that are there full time year round. Probably would be more likely folks that are there. There could be some migrants in there, not to say that there's not, but we just don't have a way of knowing for sure.
Thank you. Just a correction to Anthony's comment in the beginning. He wrote back he meant to say Plains and not Midwest. Next question from Pade. My education began in agriculture, but income changed over time to include education, healthcare. After health challenges, I've been unable to find rural land for small-scale agriculture, despite possible remote work to earn income. How do I get the small rural land for organic farming?
Sorry, how to get?
How do I get small rural land for organic farming?
Yeah, that would be purchasing that land, out in the countryside. It's going to be cheaper outside of metropolitan areas, I would think. Naturally, there's a lot of resources around land prices for agriculture that you can find. I think University of Missouri even publishes some stuff for a lot of different areas. But if you Google that, you could probably find that type of per acre cost.
And as another plug for CARES HQ, we also have a map layer of soil productivity. And so you can, if you're looking at purchasing land for agriculture, that is a map layer you can pull up and see how productive it might be for your crops of choice. I'm not sure I have anything more to offer other than that, though.
Thank you. Next one from Wyatt. Thank you for the presentation. How do you see use value assessments affecting off-farm income?
Yeah, I don't know that I would really have insights into that. I think you're talking, Wyatt, about the value of those lands based on whether it's a crop or livestock, and so that assessment of that land for those uses.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, generally, the general finding from looking at all farm income and the different types of farms that are there in that report that's here at the link right there, you can kind of see the different types of farming and really how important all farm income is to those different types of commodities. For example, farms. Now these are average numbers, so it's not every single in one farmer in particular, but it is really interesting. You'll see differences, for example, from dairy to general crop and so forth. The general idea is that if you're going to have a large farm and you're doing a large amount of capital investment, you're generally relying less on off-farm income, obviously, because you're hoping to have higher revenues. And those really big farms, although small in number, capture a whole lot of agricultural sales versus the typical farmer is really a person who has another job as well, and relies a lot on that farm. or I'm sorry, that off-farm income to actually support their household. That's your typical farmer, but it's your typical farmer out in North Dakota, for example, is going to be a larger farm operation, let's say, than in the Southeast, where that farmer is likely going to have a smaller plot of land and is also going to have another job in another industry to support their household.
A follow-up question from Wyatt. Do the available HQ CARES data include Virginia?
Yes, so CARES HQ is a national service, so it has data for the entire United States. And when available, it has even Puerto Rico and other territories as well.
Thank you. A question from CK. Are farmers included in your agricultural job numbers? Are farmers included in the LED data?
Good question. In the agricultural job numbers, yes, they are. They are included in those. But in the LED data, there is a the concept that LED is doing is matching payroll employees to their job and they know where they know where you live and they know where that payroll employer job is, because businesses report this information to each state's Department of Labor. And in our case in Missouri, that information is reported, and then it goes up to census so that way they can assign the home location and work location. Now, I say payroll because a lot of farmers are self-employed and don't get captured in the LED data. So in the LED, I generally say it's more of a payroll type of commuting situation. Now, some farms can be captured in that really larger farm operations, but a lot of those smaller farm operations, the self-employed, are excluded from that. So it's a good question.
Next question is from Rob. Are there penalties if land is not cultivated?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't think that there's penalties.
Yeah. Next question from Anthony. How do land banking and land trusts fit in with a pushback to allow agriculture?
How do land banking and land trusts fit in with a pushback to allow agriculture? I'm not sure I could speak to that in particular. I haven't done any research on the land trust operations in particular, unfortunately.
Question from Gail. Do our jobs for farmers, spouses, children, other dependents reported in this data?
That it is. So, and also there's a change in the way USDA, when they were asking people if they were a principal operator of a farm, that definition has kind of changed a little bit over time. And so, for example, prior to 2017, a lot of times you would mainly just get one principal operator, and oftentimes that was a male operator, and that information, didn't really capture the whole farm household as well as it should have. So, because many times a married couple is really they're really partners in running that business. So in 2017, that definition was changed a little bit, and so you'll see that actually in some of the USDA numbers, their principal operators can include up to I think 3 or so people, and they oftentimes now do count the spouse, which is oftentimes female in this case, as the operator. So in 2017, it is a more inclusive definition of farm operators that are included. But USDA defines the principal operator as the person or persons who are managing the operations on that farm. If you looked at people who were not in that principal operator position, basically they are just people who worked on the farm. Well, they're at even higher numbers of working all farm jobs than, say, principal operators. But we limited it to principal because that's your main manager of that farm, if that makes sense.
Your next question from Brandon. Is there any relationship between off-farm income and hurricanes other than other crop impacting bad weather. Are farm households more likely to work off farm when the weather causes a bad harvest?
I did study that in particular, but I would hazard the guess yes. So on the one side, a farm income is that, especially in areas where there's tends to be periodic natural disasters, whether that's hurricanes or flooding and so forth. Most farmers do have insurance, and so they are protected to some level with insurance to help with that income. When they have a bad year. But generally, if you're at a place where you can work at another off-farm job, then typically you're going to take advantage of that. Now you think about hurricanes hitting, a lot of the southeastern areas, and there the geography, the space between cities and the rural areas are a lot closer put together than they are, say, out in Kansas and Iowa and stuff, where you could have farm acreage that really stretches over the whole county. So it's easier for someone, for example, in the southeast, to be closer to other job opportunities than it would be in a place up in say the Midwest or upper Midwest. But generally, although I haven't studied it, I would think that theory holds a lot of water, if you will.
Thank you from Rob. And the next question is from Will. His question is, what definition of farm is used in the data? USDA farm surveys or something else?
It is USDA data that we're using for that. And and when we looked at the different counties by what's called typology, that is USDA farm typology assignment that they do.
Okay, the next question is from Donna. Commercial farmers versus private family farmers. How many are small family owned, where families are working more than one job to keep the small family going?
Well, the data we use specifically pulled out just farming households, and there is a separate category in USDA called commercial farming, which is obviously not a household. It is a commercial farm. Now, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but they're a pretty small percentage of all farms. I'd say less than 5%. But of course, commercial farms are usually very big, and they're going to be usually running very big operations. So they're not that all farm income isn't even tracked for commercial farms because it's not a household. But generally, the typical farmer is a very small household, and so again, they're mostly relying on that all farm income to help support their household.
Thank you. From Roxanne, we have a question. 26% of family farms have debt. Can you remind us of the income threshold of what qualifies as a family farm? Can you speak to income stratifications of family farms with debt? Do they tend to be lower or higher income farms?
I can't remember off the top of my head the exact threshold for farm income. It's a high enough level that a lot of people do get missed if they're doing, and I can't remember the exact number, if it's 5,000 or 10,000 in sales or higher, but you can think of a lot of people who do small farming and maybe farmers markets who are going to be under that radar and they're not counted. And that could be one measurement challenge, is just that the USDA is not going to capture everybody who's doing some type of farming. But when you think of stratification, it really it does go up generally with the sales of that farm, that as I should say it's actually an inverse relationship. As you go up in scale of that farm and you're doing more and more larger scale farm operations and sales, generally you're working less and less off the farm because you have to dedicate more of that time to actual commercial and to the operation of that business. So really it's that smaller farm that is going to be more diversified in their income because they're going to have that all farm income, but they also have less debt as well because they're not having to buy as big of equipment and capital expenses as large farming operations are. So large farming operations will have a really large debt to finance, but they've also got a really large scale operation, so they're able to finance it with that farm income. If you're in the middle area, you know, you're just not quite a large farmer, but you still have a fairly sizable farm, then you can have a case where you have a lot of debt, and you're going to rely on that off farm income. A lot of times with spouses and children and stuff, you're working there together to have that household income help support that family.
Thank you. A follow-up question from Gail. Does that change in definition of principal operator hurt your time series data?
It really we're always focused just on the principal operator. And so it does, you can look back at the chart, and let's just see if I can get back here. Show it back here. Right here, for example, really that switch from 2017 and 2012, I think was the actual switch. But you can see here in 2017, the principal operator can include up to 4 individuals. So you can see, however, though, for all these other time periods from 1970 to 87 to 97 to 2007, it was still going up, right? And that was when it was really counting a principal operator as one person. So it's still going up. It's just that when you get into 2017, then you get a broader definition. But it doesn't take away from that larger trend.
Thank you. Next question. This is from CK. Do your farm income numbers include subsidy and or farm insurance payments?
The total income analysis that we did include that. Yes. So it includes what USDA tracks is basically all the income sources that come into a farm. So it really defines it into 3 big buckets: farm income, off farm earned income, which is your job that you're going to have off the farm, and then off farm unearned income, which is a distinction where that's going to be your retirement, your Social Security, other benefits like that, and other payments like that, other kind of transfer payments. I just didn't show that here in the report, sorry, or in this presentation.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. A follow-up statement from Anthony. According to ChatGPT, my question: preservation of agricultural land, long-term planning, conservation and stewardship, supporting new farmers' education and training programs. So that was just a response from him. Our next question comes from Donna. Her question is: commercial farm service larger communities, small family farms smaller communities, working on farms, the kind of farms, fish or produce, etc. What is sampled in the research?
I'm not exactly sure on the question there, but we used USDA data, and the Economic Research Service there was helpful in providing some slicing of data in some different ways. USDA has a couple of different ways to pull out their information, and some of them some of the tools have different levels of user friendliness, if you will. But it was all USDA data. So.
And Alan, it was a variety of agricultural types. So it could be like livestock production as well as like grain and produce. Is that right?
Yes. It's all. It counts for all. We had numbers on the different types.
I think that's the second part of that question on working on kinds of farms with fish or produce, et cetera. I think it was broad enough to include all those different types.
Yeah, you can imagine how fast that data gets really large when you're trying to analyze the big trends there. But it's definitely in the report. You can see how it's broken out by different regions and different types of farms to look at not only the median farm incomes compared to their non-farm incomes, but also in that debt ratio that you see at different types of farming. So, for example, younger farmers are concerned that we're concerned with making sure that younger farmers are getting into the business and what are their characteristics. And then you do have different characteristics by those regions, and especially the USDA farm resource regions. So.
Thank you. Our next, our comments from Roxanne. Thank you for your helpful explanation on family farms with debt. Our next question comes from Jess. How does on-farm non-agricultural income calculated? How does on-farm non-agricultural income calculated, for example, agrotourism, event, venue, etc., etc.?
How does non-farm income affect?
I believe the data is only revenue from farming activities. Is that right, Alan? So if they rented out their barn for an event, that would not be included in agricultural income?
It doesn't. It could be very possibly included. It's just not distinguished in the data that we have. We just don't have an agritourism breakout of that information.
Thank you.
Their books.
You. Our next question comes from Wyatt. What are some best practices you would recommend for counties interested in supporting rural land preservation as policy while balancing the needs for more services in rural areas to support proximity to off-farm income?
Well, I think some of the things that I think about, you're talking about rural land preservation. I'm in the context of this study, I'm really looking at, to me, what one of the foundational questions is, we have a farming industry that is at risk in a lot of places. They already are a lot of times making low income, especially the typical farmer on their farm income. And so they're relying on these off-farm jobs to help support them. And that's, if you're in the farming industry, that's not a new story to you. You kind of, you know that story. But I think a lot of times we don't know that story as people not in that farming side of things and not in those rural communities. And so back to the point of the early introduction about sometimes policies can, while they can be meant to help rural communities, sometimes they can unfortunately cause hurdles for good development practices, because sometimes the funding is tied to very strict definitions of what that rural area is. For example, USDA has a lot of good programs, but a lot of them have very different population requirements. And so there's kind of a big mix of population requirements that even USDA many years back said, you know what, this can be confusing and really not be the best for these diverse communities. But it hasn't been able to change that yet. So things like standardizing the populations to more reflect the fact that rural communities and urban communities are a lot more connected than we think. Rural producers are driving to cities for those jobs, and so that's an important thing that we need to understand that connection to help make sure our policies don't inadvertently run us afoul of trying to help those rural communities when in fact they're so tied to their surrounding areas.
Thank you. Next question from Henrietta. How do Black farmers fit into this data?
I didn't have distinctions of farmers by different race or ethnicity. It's a darn good question, but I didn't look at it from that standpoint. It was really just more from that production side, what types of activities they were producing. So whether it's livestock or dairy or other things like that. So Tanya, I do have to run to another meeting in just about 3 minutes, so I might need to wrap up soon.
Thank you. I'll turn the microphone back over to Erlene at this time.
Okay, so apologies for not being able to answer all the other questions. There were only a couple more, but wow, these were great questions. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to Alan and Justin for their outstanding presentation. Alan and Justin, would either or both of you like to make closing remarks?
Well, I just want to say thank you for having us. Please check out the full report if you want to see some more details. It's an important story that we hope more and more people come to understand the interdependency of regions, especially when we think of urban and rural areas and how really tied together they are, and even more so in the most recent times. So appreciate everyone's listening and appreciate the questions. Really do. Wish we had more time. I just got to jump to another meeting, but thank you again.
All right, well, before I close out, Greg has added an evaluation in the chat. Please take the time to answer this evaluation so we can better serve you. And again, I just want to thank Alan and Justin for such an outstanding presentation today. Please join us as our LED webinar series continues on June 21st at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Annalise Vance Sherman and Scott Bailey present using census data and quarterly wage files to analyze the COVID recession and recovery. Until then, on behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thank you for spending your day with us.
This concludes today's webinar. Thank you for attending. You may disconnect at this time.